Hey, this is Patrick Sullivan. Welcome to my shop. I love tools. For years, I found that I couldn't walk by a new hardware store without turning in and heading straight for the tool section like I was hypnotized. When you suffer from this kind of weakness, the internet can be a dangerous thing. I now have so many tools that I can hardly turn around in my shop. However, the tools that have given me the greatest pleasure are the ones that I made myself. Even if the finished tool fell a little short of my expectations, the process of making it drew me closer to it than to any tool that simply required my credit card number. Hand planes are one of those tools that are satisfying to both make and use. I started with this simple block plane, and I progressed on to more complicated versions, like this rabbit plane that I made about 30 years ago out of an Australian hardwood called Quila. The wood has discolored in a curious blotchy way, and the blade, which I forged myself, still has some rather crude tool marks that expose my amateur blacksmithing. But it worked nicely from the get-go. I later bought a much more sophisticated rabbit plane, but I've never even considered disposing of this early effort. It's in retirement. It's an old friend. I never really got tired of making planes, and I got better at it. For instance, this small plane out of Cocobolo not only works great, but it's prettier, and I think it's more graceful. However, I never made a spokeshave. I thought the time had come to remedy that oversight. A spokeshave is, in essence, a very, very short plane. This picture is a Lie-Nielsen No. 4 smoothing plane. Take away the wooden handle and knob, and then remove the entire back half of the metal body. Cut the front of the body back almost to the mouth, and then chop off the long blade to a much shorter length. Add a couple of handles, and you have a spokeshave. In fact, it looks a lot like my ancient Stanley No. 151 metal spokeshave shown here. Please note that Lie-Nielsen makes some very elegant-looking spokeshaves that are not just cut-down versions of their smoothers, so please don't judge them by my overly simplistic graphics. Spokeshaves have probably been around for, since the invention of spokes, I guess, or maybe since the invention of spears and arrows. Every culture that has advanced beyond the Stone Age has produced them. It should come as no surprise, then, that there are lots of different designs. The spokeshave I decided to build is a very traditional wood body design that lived in every woodworker's toolbox a century ago. It's an ultra-low-angle design. The blade sits almost flat on the work surface, tilted just 2 to 3 degrees. This gives the tool a very different feel from a shave like my Stanley 151. I decided to buy a couple of blades from Hawk Tools in Fort Bragg, California. The owner, Ron Hawk, has specialized in making plane blades and spokeshave blades, and a lot of master woodworkers own some of his steel. Ron also offers plans and advice for making the wood body on his website, which I have listed in the description below. I read his advice carefully, and then stole all his good ideas. Thanks, Ron. I built the larger size spokeshave first. I was so pleased with the way it turned out that I decided to make a video when I produced the second, smaller spokeshave. The blank for this tool came from a large piece of hard maple with some tiger stripe figure, which I've stored in my shop for several years. I'm a sucker for tiger stripe maple. The blank is 10 inches long, or 255 millimeters, and 7/8 of an inch thick, or about 22 millimeters. I cut the blank a little wider than its final size to make it easier to handle. The blade sits in a mortise. You can cut this by hand, but the bottom of the mortise needs to be dead flat and of uniform depth. I'm willing to admit that some of my hand-cut mortises are not dead flat. The easiest and most dependable way I know to do this is to cut the mortise with a router. I marked the projection of the blade onto the router fence. Then I marked the position of the mortise itself on the blank and slid it along the fence, stopping when the edge of the router bit touched the end of the mortise. I marked where the far end of the blank reached on the fence and put a stop on the router table to limit the horizontal travel to exactly that point. I did the same thing at the other end of the mortise. I think this method is relatively foolproof. You can see exactly where the bit will cut and where the stop needs to be located. To ensure that the router cut was the right length and depth and spacing, I cut a scrap of MDF exactly the same size and shape as the maple blank and tested the router setup. I made a small adjustment and then cut the real wood. Next, mark the outlines for the wedge-shaped throat. The throat's exactly the same width as the cutting edge of the blade. I did realize that these marks were off a little bit. I made the corrections off camera. However, before I cut the throat, I prepared to drill the holes that will mount the blade. I measured the distance between the two threaded rods that hold the blade. By the way, these rods are called tangs. The easiest way to do this is to measure the width from one outside edge to the other, and then subtract the width of one tang. Transfer this measurement to the mortise. I marked the center line of the mortise with my marking gauge and used my calipers to mark the spacing. Double check those marks. I was a little careless, as you'll see. I drilled holes that were exactly the same diameter as the threaded rods. When I inserted the tangs, I found that I was off by about 1/100 of an inch or 1/4 of a millimeter. I corrected this with a small round file without too much effort. I've made worse mistakes. If you try to hold this blank in a typical bench vise while you saw the throat, you'll find that you're cutting at a very awkward angle and your visibility is poor. I found that it was much easier to cut a V-shaped channel in a scrap of construction lumber and hold that firmly in your vise. The Spokeshave blank can then sit in this channel at an angle that allows you to saw horizontally. I made a series of vertical cuts with a Japanese handsaw. Each cut ends just short of the layout lines. These cuts take only a few seconds each. This is an amazingly efficient way to remove wood. Just make sure you don't cut overly deep. Then clear away the waste wood with the chisel. Don't get greedy. Remove the waste wood in controlled, relatively thin layers. It's easy to split out too much. I'm sorry for all the jiggly movement in the video. I should have clamped the blank rigidly for better photography. Finish shaping the throat with a coarse file or rasp. The only critical part is the narrow end of the wedge where the throat meets the cutting edge of the blade. Don't let the throat extend past the edge of the blade until the final tuning, which will be done with a sanding block for very precise control. The sole in front of the blade is subject to wear. If it becomes eroded away, then the blade will take too thick a cut, and you'll have to rebed the blade at a lower level. For this reason, many older Spokeshaves have a wear strip inset into the body. That strip could be an extremely hard wood or metal. For my first Spokeshave, I made the wear strip out of a scrap of cattle ox, an extremely dense and finely textured wood that's sometimes called Mexican ebony in my area. For this tool, I'm using brass. Once again, I used my router to cut a recess. Same drill as before. Mark the edges of the recess and slide the blank along the router fence until the blade marks just touch the marks for the recess. Once again, I made a test cut on my MDF blank. Cut a piece of brass to roughly fit, and fine-tune the fit with a file or a disc sander. I then trimmed the width of the blank so the brass strip was flush with the front of the shave. I textured the underside of the brass with a Dremel tool slightly, and then epoxied it in place. After the epoxy cured, I beveled the edge of the brass with a file to match the slope of the throat. When I got close to the final shape, I installed the blade and drew a line at the cutting edge of the blade. The line warns me not to file away too much brass. Once the throat is fully shaped and smooth, install the blade and examine the area where the blade and the throat meet, called the mouth. First, the mouth must be a thin slot. Keeping this opening thin is very desirable. Wide, gaping mouths encourage tear out. Second, the sole in front of the blade must be slightly lower than the blade. Emphasis on the word slightly. The sole needs to be only a few thousandths of an inch or a few hundredths of a millimeter lower. Third, the sole needs to be beveled about 2 degrees relative to the blade. This provides an angle for the cutting edge to shave into the wood. To set this bevel angle, I clamped the Spokeshave in my vise with the sole raised a little over 3/16 of an inch above the bench. I cut a scrap of wood about 5 inches long and wrapped fine sandpaper around one end. I rested the sandpaper end on the sole and the other end on the bench, creating an angle of roughly 2 degrees. For all of you in metric land, my suggestion is to cut the scrap to 145 millimeters and raise the sole 5 millimeters. Check the fit frequently by screwing the blade in place. Set a straight edge on the sole and see if it contacts the blade. When it's the right height, the blade edge will be higher than the sole by about the thickness of 3 or 4 sheets of printer paper. If the mouth is not open at all, or too thin to allow shavings to pass, then file or sand off a little metal from the throat. When you have it right, you can just barely see the edge of the blade peeking out when you look across the sole. The handles can be any shape you want. In fact, you can quit now with just a rectangular bar of wood if you want. I opted for a very traditional shape. I drew this shape freehand, and I cut some templates out of thin material to try out different shapes. You can smooth and adjust the curves easily with a file or sandpaper. For this style, you need 2 templates, one for the cuts on the bottom and one for the cuts on the front side. These 2 curves are similar but not identical. The cut on the bottom is shorter and shallower than the cut on the front. These 2 cuts are at 90 degrees to each other. I left the top and the back sides flat. I cut the curves on my scroll saw, but these shapes could be made by a wide variety of other methods. If you cut this on a bandsaw, I suggest you start by drilling holes to handle the tight radius part of the curve. I made the cut on the bottom, both right and left, and then reattached the cutoffs with double-sided carpet tape. This is not essential, but it makes it easier to trace your pattern and follow it because you have a flat surface. I then rotated the blank 90 degrees and made the second cut. Pop off the offcuts, and you reveal the complex and peeling shape of the two curves. You can push or pull a Spokeshave. This handle design is based on the idea that you will mainly push it. When you do, your index fingers will end up right here. The general shape I'm showing here creates a natural recess for those two fingers. Your thumbs will press against the flat back side. This is a very comfortable shape. After cutting the curved shapes, I rounded the edges with a rasp. Once the sharp edges were gone, I just tried to make the curves seem graceful. This is entirely cosmetic, but in the shallow world that I live in, looking good is important. This is such a small piece that you can sand the wood to a glassy, smooth surface in a very short time without any power tools. I started with 120 grit paper to knock off the bumps and smooth the curves. Once it looked right, I finished with 220 and then finally with 320 grit. A traditional finish might have been boiled linseed oil or shellac. For my first Spokeshave, I used wipe-on poly, a light penetrating oil finish with some added polyurethane. This is easy to apply and it dries fairly quickly, but it requires quite a few coats because the wiping process makes each layer very thin. On this Spokeshave, I tried out a urethane finish that was really intended for high wear areas like floors and counters. This was a mistake. The product is much thicker and it builds a finish much faster, but it's less forgiving on a little project like this. Even with sanding between coats, the finish quickly got thicker than I needed or wanted. You can quit once you get the blade height right. However, it's not very hard to make the blade height adjustable. I just drilled a pair of holes, shown here, for two very small screws. I used number 4 screws, which have a diameter of about 2.6 millimeters. They need to be countersunk, but I didn't have a countersink small enough, so I used a drill bit that was the same diameter as the head of the screws. Raising these screw heads makes the Spokeshave take a thicker cut, while lowering them will give you paper-thin cuts. As an alternative, you could use headless set screws, which would require no countersinking. Before you install the blade, be sure to clean out the mortise that the blade sits in. If any oil or varnish accumulates in the recess, it may raise the blade enough to make the shavings noticeably thicker. Does it work? Oh yeah, it's a pleasure to use. With a sharp blade, it slices through softwood almost effortlessly, and it actually leaves a polished surface. It can handle hardwoods like oak, walnut, and maple without any trouble at all. So much fun to use that it makes you want to find projects that will give it a chance to perform. Carpenters from a century ago often had 5 or 6 of these Spokeshaves in their toolbox. I can see why now. I thought this was a great project and I hope you did too. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to see more. As always, thanks for watching.